It's been 3 years now since the original The Evil Within, a survival horror game directed by one of the fathers of the genre, Shinji Mikami, and now in October 2017 we've finally got the sequel, The Evil Within 2. However, with Mikami taking something of a backseat this time, the question becomes, how does this thing compare to the original? Developed by Tango Gameworks and published by everyone's favourite punching bag Bethesda. Let's get into it and find out, shall we? Taking place after the events of the first game, things have just gone from bad to worse for our boy Sebastian, who in true horror game sequel fashion has turned into a burnt out, grumpy alcoholic. Not only is he traumatized by the events that happened to him inside the STEM system, but he's now also dealing with the loss of his wife and daughter. Turns out, however, that his daughter Lily is still alive and in a place called Union, which is this artificial town being used in another STEM system created by the Mobius Group. After being reluctantly persuaded to go in after the return of his former partner, Julie Kidman, Sebastian does go in with the hopes of rescuing Lily and regaining the life he thought he lost. Now, The Evil Within 2 takes a bit of time to pick up some steam. It's roughly around 30 or so minutes before anything even remotely exciting happens, but from that point onward, it becomes a pretty damn wild ride. Being set inside literally someone else's mind, the STEM system as a plot device means that the environment and enemies within can be as outlandish as possible and not really need all that much in terms of an explanation. The Haunted from the first game are instead replaced in this game by the Lost, who are similar in style and behaviour, and they're all hostile to the player on sight, able to be avoided or put down like rabid dogs. They function like your standard zombie and they're the cannon fodder of the enemy lineup. But outside of that, the game's got a few little nifty tricks up its sleeves and comes up with some other truly horrifying and creepy opponents for Sebastian to deal with, a lot of which end up as mini boss fights to allow you to see these creations up close. Now, The Evil Within 2 categorizes itself as survival horror, and it definitely does have elements of that, mostly just in the somewhat rarity of important resources like healing items, but mostly ammunition, and also the fact that you can take some pretty hefty damage when attacked by enemies. The flow of the game goes from linear sequences where you're kind of moving down a very singular path, often chasing after a particular character for story-related reasons, then through to some more larger environments which are almost open world in a sense. These are small but detailed sections of Union with multiple buildings and houses for Sebastian to explore, all of which contain important and pivotal resources that help your chances of survival. You're never forced to explore these areas though, you can go right on and complete the main story mission if you prefer, but digging around every nook and cranny they've crammed into the game world always nets rewards. From components needed to crafting ammunition or upgrading weapons, or just as a means of interacting with other characters, completing side missions and learning a bit more about the backstory to the events unfolding.
I'll mark the location of the port. It's in the north safe house.
Like the first game too, you're able to take either a stealth or a combat approach to the gameplay, with the stealth approach being the ideal option, but not always the most fun. Either way though, you'll still want to be doing your best to kill as many enemies as possible, because enemies often drop the green gel, which is needed to upgrade Sebastian's core abilities, making him more formidable. Stealth in this game is pretty bare bones. It's the old crouch to enter stealth mode gimmick, but at least you give it an icon to show what kind of awareness state the enemy's in. So there's an icon that represents if an enemy is looking at you, if they can hear you, and lastly when they can finally see you and they've entered a combat state. At this point you can either run away if the resources don't allow for combat, or just kill them if that's easier. And there's not really any penalty for being detected unless it's one of the tougher enemy types, because you'd really ideally prefer to get the drop on these guys rather than have them initiate combat when you're not ready for it. Having said that though, it can be pretty easy to lose enemies. You only really need to break their line of sight and they often give up chasing you fairly quickly, unless they're scripted to keep pursuing you in the case of some of the boss type enemies. Certain stealth upgrades also make the stealth route a little bit overpowered. I mean, you can upgrade Sebastian to perform a corner takedown where he's able to stealth kill an enemy from a corner before they've even seen him. And I found it far too easy to just sit at a corner somewhere and let enemies come after me one after the other and just take them down without a fuss. On the other side of things, you've got the combat, and I really found the shooting in this game to just be immensely satisfying. It's one of those games that really rewards accuracy and patience during combat. If you're just going to play this like a standard third-person shooter, firing without that much of a thought and hitting enemies in the torso, well, you're going to have a bad time. Headshots are pretty much essential, or else you'll just be wasting ammo, and that satisfying pop when you blow an enemy's head off just never gets old. Sebastian's arsenal is conventional but effective. You've got a couple of pistols, a few shotguns which are par for the course, and you'll also get a sniper rifle which is just devastating when fully upgraded. Then you've got a crossbow with multiple arrow types, an assault rifle, and a flamethrower. Upgrading these weapons does become a bit of a necessity. The pistol, for instance, can take upwards of 3 or 4 headshots to kill the most basic enemies, but when upgraded it can drop down to 1 or 2. The old chestnut, the shotguns, are always good fun against zombie type enemies, but their damage is kind of offset by their really slow firing rate, so you're going to want to upgrade that too. I found the crossbow to be the most enjoyable to use. Having a bunch of different ammo types really gives the weapon a whole lot more variety. You've got basic bolts, but also explosive bolts, electric bolts, and a bolt that can freeze enemies in place. And then each of these ammo types have their own upgrade tree, forcing the player to kind of choose which type suits their playstyle the best. Once you've got the weapon set to the hotkeys that you're most familiar with, it becomes pretty damn cool flicking back and forth between them during combat and seamlessly taking out a bunch of enemies. It does kind of break away from survival horror at these moments and just become a bit more of an action game, not that that's really a bad thing. Sadly though, you can't upgrade Sebastian from his survival horror protagonist syndrome. That's the syndrome in survival horror games where the leading character moves without any kind of fuss or hurry when doing simple tasks like flipping switches or opening doors, despite there often being murderous enemies right on their goddamn back. But look, I can deal with that because they've obviously made it that way to increase the tension during those moments when you're under the pump and dealing with a very limited window of time. I've got to give Tango Gameworks props too, because visually this is a pretty damn good looking game at times. The character models are just amazing to look at, particularly during cinematics when you're looking at these close-ups of the various characters and you can see all this detail that's gone into modelling their features. Things like wrinkles and scars through to the realistic stubble on Sebastian's chin. The scripted sequences when Sebastian is hallucinating, walking down some kind of a corridor as the environment often shifts around him, are always really well thrown together, and they do their best to be as unconventional as possible. Where the game looks kind of average though is during those more open world sections. I mean, I guess the fact that these areas are larger environments means they couldn't add in as much detail, so they do look a lot less impressive. But the areas that are smaller and more linear show off a lot more polish with great lighting and a real sense of powerability. Some of the areas you explore later in the game also really defy convention and just look incredible. They've really taken full advantage of the story creatively, crafting some creepy and impressive looking areas, often which Sebastian reacts to accordingly. Now, I have been reading that people have been having issues with the game running smoothly, but that's something I can't really comment on. I've got a GTX 1080, 16GB of RAM and an i7, and I've had nothing but a solid frame rate pretty much the entire time. Loading times were pretty fast, and about the only thing I had happen was the odd hitch here and there when I was sprinting through an area, which I assumed was the result of the game loading something in. Playing for the whole thing for my first playthrough took me just under 12 hours, and that was with completing every side mission, exploring as much as I possibly could, and upgrading my weapons and Sebastian's abilities a fair bit. Considering there's the New Game Plus mode and all the unlockables you expect to get in this kind of game, I'd say you're looking at upwards of double that time if you're a bit of a completionist. And I didn't even really delve that much into the couple of side modes where you complete a few shooting gallery style mini-games to earn extra resources. I think The Evil Within 2 is going to appeal to casual horror fans due to its literal casual difficulty mode, but it's also going to appeal to those looking for a more hardcore experience, thanks to its Nightmare difficulty mode, which is available for a first time playthrough. The survival difficulty mode, which I guess is the normal difficulty, felt a little bit easy. There was only a few times when I was running genuinely low on ammunition to the point that it became a concern, but I'd say that 90% of the time I had more than enough ammo and health to get by, and it also allowed me to be a little bit reckless as well. The boss fights too are painfully simple and literally just about avoiding some pretty blatantly telegraphed attacks and firing on an obvious weak spot, which is often their head or some kind of glowing appendage that's just screaming to be shot at. The odd times when you've got to instead avoid a boss for whatever reason are generally pretty easy as well. Honestly, the only times I died in the entire game was when I got blocked in by a bunch of enemies and stun locked to death because they kept knocking me on my ass. And then when I intentionally killed myself during one of the boss fights because I'd been a bit overzealous with shooting and wanted to try it again with a more conservative approach. Otherwise, nothing's really all that tough, so for folks who want a real challenge from the get-go, I'd say go with the Nightmare difficulty. I kinda wish I did. Overall, I found The Evil Within 2 to be a hell of a good time. It's got a decent mix of stealth and shooting that doesn't really excel in either area, but it manages to be competent enough most of the time. It tells a story that is intriguing and captivating, and it never drowns you in details or exposition to the point that you lose track of what's going on. There's clear-cut bad guys and there's clear-cut good guys, and you're just some poor asshole stuck in the middle, just trying to rescue his daughter and get a second chance at life. It's maybe a little bit light on the horror aspect at times, which is a letdown, but those moments that are trying to scare you do a good job of it regardless. I know it's easy just to hate on AAA games these days because of a bias towards the developers or publishers, and Bethesda's always in the firing line for whatever reason, but if you're into a horror-themed third-person shooter, there's no real reason to not like this game. I mean, it doesn't have any day one DLC, there's no microtransactions, loot boxes, tacked on multiplayer modes, or anything of that nature. It's just a game about being trapped in a horrible, nightmarish world with monsters chasing after you, where you can often shoot or sneak your way to success. Topped off with some colourful language and gratuitous violence, and for a game released in the same month as Halloween, well, that ticks all my boxes.